So today we're talking about Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. So a little bit of context. I am a huge this is probably the first person that I ended up following whenever it came to getting into movies, enjoying movies around the age of 10 was Stanley Kubrick. So I was a bit of a fanboy of everything of his for a long time. I've kind of I do feel like there are a lot of ways that you could describe him as pretty much the perfect filmmaker. I think that he's got three movies that are totally perfect. And by that, I mean that from a technical perspective, there is not a flaw that you can find in them. And then over the course of decades and decades and decades, those movies still come up several times, whether it is they're referenced in pop culture or just anytime you talk with pretty much anyone when it comes to the best of any particular genre, there's going to be a Kubrick movie in there. Another thing that made him so good was that all of his he touched on pretty much every single genre, and whether or not you like the movies or not, you pretty much have to admit that each time he went into a new genre, whether it's horror, romance, science fiction, he left a massive mark. For me, I would say that if you want to actually take the three that are actually perfect, because of course everything he didn't make was perfect, but he did make three that I would say are totally perfect, which is so rare, which are 2001: A Space Odyssey, Barry Lyndon, and Doctor Strangelove. So today we will talk about Doctor Strangelove through the lens of what Kubrick did incredibly well in that movie. And I think overall, the thing that makes him such a good, brilliant, really storyteller is that nothing that he ever made contains any moralization at all. And one of the reasons I chose to do Doctor Strangelove this week and talking about it was recently I saw Don't Look Up, the new Adam McKay movie, which rides like the same lines that Doctor Strangelove does in terms of themes and in terms of story. But to actually compare the two, Don't Look Up is chock full with moralizing, and they feel like polar opposites of movies because of that. So to kind of prep for a review of Don't Look Up, I wanted to do a review of Doctor Strangelove and revisit to actually see what some of the differences are. But today, just going to talk about what it is that makes Stanley Kubrick's work in Doctor Strangelove so wonderful. First of all, well, I want to look at what he does and then the things that he actively does not do that I think most filmmakers do, and it keeps movies from being incredible. So what he does do, the way that he pitches his stories, and of course, this is talking about really all of his movies, but in particular, Doctor Strangelove, the way that he pitches his stories are so carefully thought through. If you look up some into the making of Doctor Strangelove, they started writing the movie as a drama, just as kind of more like a thriller, like All the President's Men type of political thriller that takes place during, obviously this was made during the Cold War, so there was a lot of tension around the Cold War. But after a long time of working with the script, it was obviously it just wasn't working. It wasn't melding at all. And he then pushed it towards being more of a comedy. They started to realize that whenever they have some of these scenes take place, they actually do we have someone? We have someone just entered into the chat, and I think they changed their name again. Good to see you, Solo Locks. I'm going to go with that. But the way that they started to see that everything that they were putting in their stories, every time that the drama wasn't working, it was not because it was bad. It was because the story actually needed to be funny in that moment. It seemed unbelievable that when talking about nuclear war and utter destruction, that the movie would end up veering towards a dramatic bent. It seemed more like this story is more of a comedy. And that was how it ended up being created as a dark comedy. It wasn't like we want to make a comedy, and so we're going to do it and we're going to try to, it's not forced at all. You can really feel that he has followed the movie. He's followed the story down the avenues that it had to go in order to work. So the movie feels like it is very naturally pitched because of that. It does nothing feels forced in this movie. That's a great thing about, I think, all of Kubrick's movies. Nothing ever really feels forced. Everything feels very natural. This story, I think, even more so than Barry Lyndon in 2001, I think feels the most natural. To make a movie about nuclear war as a dark comedy. And the fact that this was made in the 60s, whenever everyone was terrified of, tonight being the night nuclear war could break out, that was obviously not an obvious decision to make. Another thing that he does wonderfully in all of his movies, but especially in Doctor Strangelove, is the casting. And Kubrick kind of has a reputation of being a very dictatorial director, of being someone who just had like kind of had knew how it needed to be, and that was why he would do dozens and dozens and dozens of takes, and he would kind of demand excellence from everyone on set, and kind of push forward after the crew was kind of tired and done with. Whenever you hear little bits and pieces of him actually saying it, it's that most people just on a job aren't really ready, so you have to keep going and keep going and keep going to get a performance or to get a response that the story actually needs, because most people, whether you like it or not, aren't ready. That's why he says he took on that way of working. And what's amazing about the casting here is hearing people talk about Peter Sellers or George C. Scott or Slim Pickens in the way that he gave them much freer reign. No, I mean, obviously, Peter Sellers got the most free reign, and Peter Sellers does a fantastic job. You can see that to choose Peter Sellers, he is firing on so many comedic cylinders. Yes, like Detention is saying in the chat, Peter Sellers is, I saw there was one review that said that it was absolutely without a doubt his greatest performance, and that could very well be true. He's playing 3 different characters. He's playing Dr. Strangelove, he's playing the President, and he's playing Lieutenant Mandrake, and at no point does any of that come across as a gimmick, and it doesn't even feel like it doesn't even feel like they're trying to get a joke out of it. It doesn't seem like they're trying to cut corners by doing it. It doesn't feel like it's giving into Peter Sellers' ego of doing that. It honestly just feels like a risk that was taken because it served the story best, and it really does. It is fantastic how well Peter Sellers playing those 3 characters works, and at no point. The most fascinating thing about it is that it just works. It works in the way that the best things of any type of artwork, you don't notice that it's there. It's not calling attention to itself. And for Kubrick to bring someone on like Peter Sellers, let him do what needs to be done, not really giving him tons of direction, and then Peter Sellers just kind of taking it, running with it in a way that fits so wonderfully. It was an incredible stroke of genius to have Sellers in that role. And he does a fantastic job, and he's hilarious. Personally, I think Mandrake is the funniest. Mandrake sitting there listening to the general go on and on about why it is about we have to stop the commies, we have to preserve our fluids. The look of terror in Mandrake's face is so, and I guess that goes into the next part that I'm going to talk about, is the dialogue and the editing. It's so perfect. It's scary, but it's also funny because it feels real to some degree. It feels very real to some degree. It doesn't feel forced, like what I was saying. But the dialogue and the editing, I feel, go together so well. There was a recent, I saw a clip recently. I don't know when it was filmed, but it was Spielberg and Scorsese's were talking, and they were talking about how the camera, there's only one place that the camera really should be. There's tons of cool stuff that you can do, but in order to tell a story well, there's really only one place for the camera to go. And Spielberg said that the frustrating thing is figuring out where the hell that actually is, because it's almost impossible to tell where you're actually supposed to put the damn camera. And Soderbergh is also someone who has talked about, whenever it comes to filming, whenever it comes to dialogue, it's so finicky, because when it comes to dialogue, you can be one beat away in any genre from it working or it not working. And when it comes to actually filming, you can be an inch or 2 away from, something looking okay to then it looking perfect. And Doctor Strangelove is one of those movies that you could listen to the dialogue, you could listen to the sound of the movie without any visuals, or you could do the exact same. You could watch the visuals without any sound, and it looks absolutely pristine. I don't mean that it looks pretty. I mean that everything, it looks like it's clicking in terms of clockwork. The conversations, the juxtaposition of everyone's reactions to everyone else. And this is a movie that is pretty much essentially dialogue, but it is so razor sharp. And the reactions, the cuts to and from each person, it works so much like music. It's so good. Particular George C. Scott and the President, the way that they're going back and forth from one another, the way that the facial reactions respond, also Mandrake and the General, the way that they respond to one another, and the way that we're actually only given the right amount of information in terms of editing is absolutely wonderful, and it flows so well. But that's the column of stuff that I feel like Kubrick does that works, and it works with all of his movies, but I think particularly with this one, it shines brighter than everything else that he's done whenever he does what he does best. What the things that Kubrick doesn't do that I think make his movies also stand out, and these are things that I think most people really do with their movies that are kind of frustrating. He does not judge any of the characters. whenever he is talking about someone like the general, or whenever he's talking about, not talking about them, whenever he's showing us the general, or whenever he's showing us the Russians, or whenever he is showing us Turgensen, whenever he's showing us the president, there is no, whenever he's showing us the people in the plane, even who are deciding to drop this bomb, there's no judgment in the face of very difficult situations. There is no saying that, oh, the president was wrong for not doing this with the Russians. There's a scene in the movie where they actually have to shoot down American planes. There's no moralizing. There's no flag waving for sympathies between either parts. Again, imagine this is made in the 60s. Would have been very easy to do, to side with either the Russians or to have sympathies with the Americans. And that's not to say that, I think the thing that that is speaking to most is that it is just serving the story. The only thing that is important is the story. The live stream I'm gonna do on the Patreon right after this is gonna be about this issue. There's no like propaganda stuff in it, which is so easy to get in so many movies. There's no preaching in any of it. There's a very, what I like, I think the Coen brothers do this too. There's a very misanthropic type of understanding of humanity in this movie. It is a very simple, hey, humans are idiots, and to a large degree humans are kind of evil, but they're evil through stupidity. They make terrible decisions, like creating nuclear bombs, not because they want to do something evil, but because what the heck what else are we going to do? Like, hey, it's right there, we're going to do it. And you put yourself in this terrible position, and there's no saying, well, this person's right, this person's wrong. And that makes the movie so much better. I felt like, I've always thought that, I've always loved that about this movie. In particular, since Don't Look Now has become a more popular movie recently, or since it just came out, I guess, I felt that was very annoying. And comparing the two, that was something that I love. I think that's not only something Kubrick does, that's something that's so good in Doctor Strangelove. There's no distractions with all of the moralizing. And then the ending. The ending, I've always found it's a very weird ending. And another weird thing that about Kubrick is he will do things that fit. They just, on an emotional level, it feels like it works and it resonates, but it can still have this very weird ring to it. So I'm going to say what it is. You can stop watching if you haven't seen the ending. The Doomsday Machine is going to go off because they have dropped the nuclear weapon onto the Russian. They've destroyed they dropped a bomb on Russia. So it's going to make the Doomsday Machine go off. So everyone back in the war room, which absolutely beautiful production design of the war room. Everyone back at the war room is having this discussion of what they're going to do next. They're saying maybe they should go into the mines. Maybe they should, they're talking about assigning 10 females to every male. And everyone, all the men in the room are getting very, very excited about that. And then Dr. Strangelove stands up, proclaims that he can walk, and then the Doomsday Machine goes off, and then assumedly everyone in the world dies. Now, I feel like pretty much what's going on is I think that's pushing forward the ending of, in the end, people aren't actually doing things to get themselves blown up or to get themselves killed or do things that are getting everyone killed because they're actually evil. They're doing it because we're just naturally ignorant. We're just kind of stupid in our own way. I think that's what's going on in the ending. And the thing that I'm curious about, and I'm wondering what you're thinking, when it comes to, was Dr. Strangelove lying the whole time about his disability? I think that's what was going on. I think the whole time, not the whole, and that's another thing. I love the Heil Hitler thing that he's doing whenever he can't actually control his limbs anymore. It's hilarious. But I think that the entire time he was lying to get by, maybe on sympathy, who knows what, by being in a wheelchair. And then whenever they're having this discussion about how the most physically fit, the most intellectual need to go into the mines, and then they're going to receive 10 women for every man so they can procreate. I think whenever someone mentions that, that's whenever he stands up out of the chair. I think it's just perfect. I feel like it's a way of him kind of being like, oh, it's a miracle. You know what? I never had any problem. It's perfect. And I feel like it's just the same type of hey, maybe he was just trying to get out of Germany before, and that's why he faked this injury. Now he's trying to get into the mine. So he's kind of acting as if there's a miracle going on and there was nothing wrong. It's just regular old cynicism about people, but it's not moralizing about it. It's doing it in a way that's kind of like, hey, people are so fucking stupid. I love it. I love it absolutely so much. I want to go through a few of the reviews. I looked up the reviews that had happened for this movie back whenever it came out. So The Hollywood Reporter, I was very surprised about the Hollywood Reporter's review. The reporter was totally underwhelmed. Covered the movie in a way that was pretty much saying, "Yeah, it's pretty good," but it seemed very hollow. It seemed like the critic for the Hollywood Reporter back in, I forget if I think 1965, said that, "Hey, you know what? It's impressive, but there's nothing incredible about it. Nothing that's really going to stand the test of time about it. It's probably, talked about as if it's going to be forgettable." Even went as far to say at the very end of the review, he went through the editing, the production design, all that stuff, cinematography. When it came to the production design, he said that it was underwhelming. The War Room, which I would say one of the most iconic sets, iconic to the point that when you're watching it for the first time, even back then, I would think you'd have to be very impressed with that. Like, whenever it's good, it goes unnoticed. I guess that might be the point. It was so funny to see in retrospect, a critic actually said that the production design of Doctor Strangelove was underwhelming. Variety, I was not that surprised about Varieties. I was surprised that this was going on in the 60s too, but it was wholly political. Like their response to this movie back in the 60s, a movie that is not going out of its way to make political commentaries at all. Variety went nothing but the political, talking about like Republican, Democrat, Russia, the Cold War, sympathies with Russia. It's very strange. If you take some time to look up the Variety Doctor Strangelove review from the 60s, it's a very weird read. And then Roger Ebert, who actually did one in the 90s, he said he'd seen the movie, and obviously he had the luck of retrospect, so he didn't actually do a response in the 60s whenever it came out. But he pointed out he focused on George C. Scott in his review, and George C. Scott is incredible. I totally agree with his review, because in a point in it, he says that okay, I don't know if I totally agree with it, but he says that it's the strongest performance in the movie because what George C. Scott's character is doing is acting so insane to the point of overacting just about. But again, the movie is pitched so well. The premise of a dark comedy working through nuclear disaster is pitched so well that the American general that in the face of nuclear disaster is so happy that his men are so good that they can deliver a payload under Russian radar to the point they can do it so well that it will drop the bomb and cause utter destruction. In the middle of this huge grandstanding speech, he realizes what he's saying, and he realizing how horrifying it is and what it means for everyone. But the bombasticness of his performance throughout the whole thing, in any other movie, in so many other movies, in a ton of other Kubrick movies, would be so bizarre. But in this one, it fits perfectly. I do kind of feel like that is something that's wrong with The Shining. There are a few times in The Shining wherever Jack Nicholson it feels like his performance is living in another movie that doesn't fit in that one. But that's the thing. With George C. Scott, it's working at such an elevated level, but the movie's pitched at that level, and it works so well. So thank you for everyone that has watched this. We're recording this on the 19th of January. Next Wednesday at 5 p.m., we're going to do a review of Don't Look Up. So be sure to check that out. This Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern time is the weekly movie update. So thank you for everyone that has joined. And please be sure to subscribe to 5 Minute Critic on YouTube for future updates on reviews and movie news.